Know me, my name is Rajan. I'm the Dean and the George Schultz Professor of Accounting at Chicago Booth. I want to thank all of you who have logged in today. We have a fantastic event. I'm thrilled to welcome our alum, Bill Conway, alderman of the 34th Ward of Chicago, back to Chicago Booth for the Distinguished Speaker Series. As you know, this is a series where we bring in high-profile leaders from business, from the community, from government, back to the school to share their insights and experience. And we've had great alumni in recent years. Going back, we had Matt Maloney, JP Gann, Tom Ricketts, Mark Oplemazian. This year, we've done in-person chats with Howard Marks from Oak Tree. We had our alum Mark Levitt along with Danny Meyer. And just last month, we had a great chat with Ramsey and Hugh from Veritas. So let me give an intro to Bill. So Alderman Bill Conway is a lifelong Chicagoan. He's a Navy vet, reservist, and a former Cook County prosecutor. Bill is a naval intelligence officer. He has served in Afghanistan, Qatar, and most recently the European Command Headquarters in Stuttgart. He has the rank of lieutenant commander and is the only active military reservist in the history of Chicago City Council. Bill teaches finance at DePaul. He has developed solar solutions for schools and other uses of power. Bill has an amazing academic record. He did his BS. We won't hold it against him from Wharton, a law degree from Georgetown, and an MBA from Chicago Booth. And he and his wife, Brittany, are raising their 3 young daughters in the 34th Ward. So I'm going to give you a list of all the things Bill is involved with. He's vice chair of the City Council Finance Committee. He's on the Committee for Budget and Government Ops, Environmental Protection and Energy, License and Consumer Protection, Special Events, Cultural Affairs and Recreation, Transportation and Public Way, and Zoning, Landmarks, and Building Standards. We're thrilled to have Bill here today to share insights from his amazing career. So we have a bunch of questions that people have sent in, but please feel free to send in stuff through the Q&A button down. I will take my questions. I will add things that you bring up to talk to Bill. So first of all, Bill, thank you very much for coming back.
Oh, Dean, thanks for having me. Very excited. I'm coming to you live from City Hall here, actually. So I hope it looks like governing is happening behind me, but also chaotic governing.
So let me talk about Booth first. So you,
Sure.
like many of the students, came part-time to Booth. What made you take the decision to come to Chicago Booth?
Well, my father went to Booth and always talked about what an incredible experience he had, and I always, I was not really planning on getting my MBA. I had gotten my undergraduate business degree from a different institution, so I never really thought I was going to get my MBA. And I remember speaking to two distinguished alums in David Vitale, who had actually gone there at the same time as my father, who had become head of the Board of Education in Chicago, as well as Ron Huberman. And he had been a police officer by day and then got his MBA at night. And he went on to lead the Office of Emergency Communications for the city, as well as the CTA. And both of those guys really talked about how Booth prepared them for their role in public service. And that made me think, I guess what I had assumed was that Booth wouldn't really have any intersection in public service that changed. And at this point in time, by the way, I was a prosecutor at the state's attorney's office, but I always thought I'd be doing something in public service, not necessarily as an elected official. That kind of came later, but that was what led me to Booth.
And you've had an incredibly diverse career, as I talked about, right? You've been a prosecutor, military officer, you've been a faculty member, and now alderman. Just talk about sort of what made you go through those different steps and how has that shaped the way you think about leadership and public service?
Yeah, so I wish I could tell you there was, some real purpose there, but as I always tell my students at DePaul, like, look, if you don't know what you want to do when you grow up, like, I think we're all figuring it out even much later in life. So after I graduated from Wharton, I graduated in 2000. I started a .com business with a few folks, which ended up doing fine, but it was by no means lucrative. And at that point, I really thought, well, what am I going to do now? And sort of almost stumbled into law school. I said, well, I've been interested in the law, so I went to Georgetown for law school. Really enjoyed my time there. Became very interested in criminal law and really trial practice. So I said, I'll probably end up back in corporate America, but I'm going to go to I'll work at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for a bit. And that bit turned out to be 7 years. And after 3 or 4 years, I got the new state's attorney, Anita Alvarez, took over in 2008. And she had brought in a new head of like the Major Crimes Bureau. And it's a guy named Jack Blakey, who had been a U.S. attorney. Interestingly, Jack Blakey was a federal judge now, and he just was the judge on Mike Madigan's trial, by the way. So, but I went and bothered Jack, and I said, look, I'm kind of in the minor leagues here, but I really want to prosecute financial crimes. And he said something like, no one in the history of this office has actually ever wanted to go to that unit. So they promoted me like 20 levels to go to financial crimes, which was this backwater, but then they combined it with public corruption. And then it just became just a fantastic job. But it was during this time that I got my MBA at night at Booth. And then when I was nearing graduation from Booth, my boss came to me and said, look, the problem is we can't really promote you in this job because you passed up all these other levels. So you have to get demoted before you can get promoted again. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And at that point, so I pivoted and went into investment banking. And it was kind of at a fortuitous time. I mean, there's not a lot of part-time students who go into banking unless they were there before. But as I'm sure many of the listeners know, viewers rather, when banks are hiring, they're kind of looking 2 years in the future. Or in my case, in fall of 2011, they were hiring their summers for summer of 12, who would start in fall of 13. So I graduated in March of 13, and in 11 we thought we were looking at some kind of double dip recession, and obviously that didn't materialize. So a lot of the banks had underhired essentially. So I went and worked at J.P. Morgan in the investment bank, which I'm proud of that, but I guess we've scrubbed it from my political bio, which is why it didn't make the intro. And then from there, I'd been in the Navy Reserve a long time, so I got initially deployed in like mid 2017.
So you've managed private capital, obviously,
Yeah.
and you're now managing public resources. What do you see fundamentally similarities, differences between them?
Well, when you're managing private capital, especially your own private capital, you're very focused on, this is why I'm doing this. This is why, this is how I'm going to measure whether this works. You're very, very focused on how will you measure success in a way. On the public side, it is, I take myself out of this, but it's your public officials, it's not their money. And then as a result, how do you measure return on investment becomes a much more difficult thing. You can't just think about it in investment returns, because a lot of times it's not that easy. But for example, we just passed this thing in city council where we are going to essentially borrow $135 million and put it into a revolving equity, kind of an equity fund that is supposed to create like 400 affordable housing units a year. And, sounds like we have a huge housing shortage. It sounds like at its, basic level sounds like a good idea. But when you kind of start doing the math on that, you realize it doesn't pencil. But still hard to get people to vote against money we've essentially already borrowed being used to create housing. Like they can't see beyond that. So you have different issues with regard to return on investment on the public side.
Mm-hmm.
I voted against this, by the way, because
Mm-hmm.
it didn't pencil, which I learned at Booth. BS.
So just talk about your own ward then, Bill. Like, what are some of the big issues, challenges you see facing it, and how could you think about addressing them?
Yeah, so my ward is it's like Loop, West Loop area. I have most of the Loop, little bit of South Loop, Greektown, Little Italy, and then sort of part of the West Loop. I have everything. I don't have the bustling kind of Randolph and Fulton Market corridor. Kind of everything south of that, down to Little Italy and UIC, etc. So when I think about what we face, I mean, we have public safety challenges all over the city. I mean, Chicago has led the nation in murders each and every year for the past 13 years. And while downtown is probably the safest area of the city, we are no stranger to crime here. Um, Beyond that, I would say, we have a lot of developments all over on the Loop side and the West Loop side. And how do we balance like infrastructure as we're looking at that new development? Specifically, I'd say with Little Italy and Greektown, they're two wonderful neighborhoods that are kind of losing their ethnic character.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we go about trying to preserve that through zoning and permits and other things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I guess another one would just be State Street. State Street, sort of south of Madison, is not doing well for. I mean, I'm sure is no secret to anybody with so much vacant retail. And what do we really do about that? So those are some of the challenges that I face within my ward specifically.
Mm-hmm. And maybe if we could just take it a bit broader to Chicago as a whole, like what do you feel are like the big priorities for the next like 20 years that you think the city has to solve?
The city has to focus on three things, and these are things I when I go to work, I'm thinking about. One, public safety. Two, our fiscal situation. And three, economic growth. And I could talk a little bit high level on each one of those things, how I see them.
Mm-hmm.
So on the public safety side, I did mention the stat on us leading the nation in murders. The good news is, for the first time since 2019, we had less than 600 murders in Chicago. However, we had like 573. But in New York, they had 377, and I think in Los Angeles it was 268. So, and obviously those are much larger cities. In fact, they have homicide rates that are like 80 and 90% lower than ours.
Mm.
So an obvious question is, what are they doing that we're not doing? And the answers are really a full embrace of community policing, which means keeping officers where they are so they begin to learn the players, the hot spots, et cetera, of what's going on in their areas, as opposed to sort of, trying to, follow the soccer ball wherever it goes. That's the first thing. And also, by the way, that comes with significant transparency so that people build a better trusting relationship with police. The second thing they're doing is they've really embraced technology. And I'm not just talking about ShotSpotter, which some of you all might be familiar with, but they have like really predictive policing for AI. Some have facial recognition in some places. Significant use of surveillance drones, which I'm not sure that's a good thing, but they are using them. Well, here, I did mention ShotSpotter earlier, and for those that don't know, it's like acoustic gunshot recognition technology. And the University of Chicago Crime Lab says that this technology saved about 85 lives a year. And for whatever reason, at the end of September, the mayor made a campaign promise he was going to get rid of it. 35 of 50 aldermen implored him to not do that, but nonetheless, he did do it. So, I mean, I could speak on the other two as well, Dean.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, especially the financial.
Public safety, just trying to hit the high points on some of these. On our fiscal health, I think everyone knows it's bad, but when I got in here, it is so much worse than I think people realize. And it has the ability to subsume everything we're doing. We won't be able to invest in infrastructure or schools or what have you unless we really start to attack this problem. And putting some just numbers around it for our upcoming budget. City of Chicago budget is about $18 billion. But if you sort of take out debt payments and pension payments, it's about $13 billion. This coming year, we are facing a $1.2 billion deficit. So it's like, 8 or 9% of government. And a lot of things are already really baked in as far as raises and some other things. So even just this one year, it's going to be difficult. And then on the economic growth side, when Bill Daley was running for mayor, he used to say the city needs to, the goal of the next mayor should be to get it to 3 million people. We have about 2.65 million people in Chicago now, which is roughly the population that Chicago was in 1920, by the way.
Mm.
And the things that are really holding us back are housing and jobs. And those things, obviously go together significantly. On the housing side, we have like very high rents. So you're thinking, why aren't people developing in Chicago? And a lot of the reasons for that are red tape, an uncertain property tax situation based on the fiscal situation, and then our criminal crime issues as well. And on the economic growth side, it's there are so many weird little parts of red tape that unfortunately in government we hold back. As a brief little story, when I took over as alderman, I had Ferrero Candy was trying to open an innovation lab in the Marshall Fields building, and I will always call it that, by the way. But they couldn't, and there was going to be 120 good paying jobs there, and they couldn't open because they were replicating a lab that they had in Italy. And so they brought all the same equipment over, and all the equipment was CE certified and not UL certified, the CE being the European equivalent of that. And they couldn't open because the ordinance says it has to be all UL certified. So I remember I was calling the head of the Department of Buildings every day, being like, you got to solve this problem. It's stopping 120 people from coming to work. And it took 30 to 40 days. They eventually got an exception to policy and it opened, but it is a bizarre, I could tell 5 more stories like that, which are
Mhm.
sort of a disturbing peek into the city's red tape.
Mhm.
Not to mention, you never hear, I mean, you always hear crazy stories about Rahm Emanuel, like scaling fire escapes to break into meetings to get businesses to come to Chicago, and you haven't really heard about anybody doing that since him.
Mhm. Just want to tell the audience, feel free to send in stuff through Q&A. I can put them in with my questions as well. So we had a question about the parking meter deal that you brought up, and says
Yeah.
maybe one of the worst deals of all time. Is there any way to renegotiate it? Is that even possible? Kind of.
I don't. I read that contract to see is there some kind of weird loophole. It seems like every mayoral candidate ever has said we're gonna make this sue them as an unconscionable contract and blah 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 blah, and then it sort of never happens. I don't see a way out of it, but I will say this: there seems to be a few things that we can do to make it more financially palatable. Um, one for example, as I think of one thing, is that if we shut down a meter for 8 hours, we have to essentially pay for that meter. If we shut down a meter for 4 hours, we can do that either by the hour or free of charge. So you're thinking when we say, okay, we're going to do street cleaning on this day, we have to pay for the entire meter. Well, imagine we say we're going to do street cleaning for this morning, and then all of a sudden, we can save money that way.
Mhm.
It's also worth noting that once we are short on the number of meters we told them we would provide. Despite, by the way, my ward's getting pounded with additional meters. So is Alderman Riley's, which is kind of the other part of the loop, and River North. And then Alderman Burnett, who's more of the West Loop. We have more meters being added, but there are areas of the city that have like no meters at all, or they've taken some out. So, but once you sort of get beyond the amount of meters you're supposed to have, then actually the city can make money doing it. And the monitoring is kind of taken care of, um,
Mhm.
between us and the company. So there
Mhm.
are a lot of better ways that we can manage that contract. So it's not the financial sinkhole that it consistently is.
Mhm. So a couple more questions sort of related to the budget, different things. The first question is about, do you have a stance about sort of the teachers union? Second is about the pension shortfall and what we think we're going to do about it, in
Well,
whichever
those are
form you want to take
Well,
it.
no, those are both tough questions. So, it's worth noting one thing about city government is city council has oversight over certain things, but then there's also sister agencies that we kind of have different oversight over. So the Chicago Public Schools, as an example, what we do is we um, used to have advise and consent power over the Board of Education members, and then they sort of run the school district. Um, Actually, Board of Ed's a bad example. The CTA, that's the case, and the Park District, that's the case. So we have different oversight on all those. Board of Ed actually was something where it was mayoral appointment because everybody in Springfield liked Mayor Daley, and he asked for that, and there we go. But now the school board itself is going to be entirely elected. So there's not going to be any mayoral oversight or city council's oversight over CPS at all. So that is going to be a real issue with in terms of the teachers union. The bad part of that for them is that by law they can only raise their portion of property taxes by 5% a year.
Mm.
So that's like Springfield has put that governor on it, and they have now signed a contract with the teachers union that's going to probably require them to do more than that, unless they do something else within that. And there's a moratorium on closing schools. They can't fire anybody. So it's hard to see without some intervention elsewhere how they're going to be able to get paid out on their contract, which is,
Mm-hmm.
significant issue. So we face in Chicago, I mentioned we have about an $18 billion budget with a deficit. We have, as far as pension liability, give or take 37 or $38 billion pension liability. And then beyond that, we have about 29 billion in debt. So that is the terrible fiscal situation that we find ourselves. And it is enshrined in the Constitution, in the Illinois Constitution, that nothing can be done to infringe on pension obligations. So it's also worth noting that in Illinois, the city of Chicago cannot go bankrupt. What happens at that point is the state just subsumes all the debt. So there's not a way out of it like New York going bankrupt in the 70s, or what Detroit as well. So we're going to have to figure a way out of this with being really judicious with taxpayer dollars and bringing everyone to the table. But if you were to start trying to even mess with pension obligations, you have to change the Illinois Constitution, which probably not possible.
Mm-hmm. Question asking, do you have an opinion on the idea of establishing a city charter, and would that be helpful at all?
Yeah, part of the issue that we have in city government is a lot of processes are a little bit ad hoc, not only in just how the committees work, but also in terms of how each ward works. For example, the way I handle development is way different than the neighborhood wards, and it makes sense a bit because we have my ward's very different, but my development process is different than Alderman Riley's and Alderman Burnett's even, and their wards are very similar. So a city charter, I think, would really standardize those processes. The problem is, and also really establish how city council and the mayor's office are supposed to work together. The problem is that it's the toughest to pass a city charter when you most need it. So as like a hypothetical, let's say you had like a very unpopular mayor who didn't have a lot of desire to work with city council in that hypothetical situation.
Mhm.
That would be the time when you cannot get a city charter passed, and that's exactly when you need one.
Mm.
So, I think a city charter is a good idea and would be a working document to help help our processes.
We have a couple of related questions, sort of about, you're Chicago alum. What can we do to sort of take advantage of having these great universities? What can local government do to incentivize more like companies to come in, to hire more businesses in general? Any thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, and I'm happy that whoever asked that question, because a lot of times in this, like even in this presentation, I've been like, we got more murders than everybody. The fiscal situation's a mess. We're not growing economically. But I think we do have to remember that Chicago has a lot going for it. I mean, we have, abundant fresh water right outside Gleacher there. We have sprawling transportation network. We have top flight universities, as you mentioned, a thriving arts and culture scene, a skilled workforce, a very diverse economy. I think no industry occupies more than, I believe, 12% of Chicago's economy. So Chicago has a lot going for it, and
Mhm.
that's uh, I think we have to, not even the politicians have screwed those things up. So as a result of that, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. It's just going to take a generation of hard work to do that.
Mhm. Um, Let me try to phrase this question that came in sort of about like your fellow aldermen, and do you feel like they are free market capitalist leaning or not? And how does the mix of people on city council
Yeah.
affect whether things get
Yeah, I would say they're probably not free market capitalists. I believe that in city, so we have 50 aldermen in the
Mhm.
city, and 9 of them are proudly democratic socialists, and they embrace that label. And then you have a lot more that are very much believe in government intervention. So when you talk about housing, I said housing is one of the things that's preventing us from growth, and despite the fact that we have astronomical rents, as I mentioned, if you think, well, from an economic point of view, there's two ways you could maybe bring down rents. One of them is by government intervention. You could uh, do things that sort of prevent gentrification. You could talk about rent control, et cetera, et cetera. Um, that's sort of bucket one. Bucket two is you could simply increase the supply of housing, and then housing prices will come down naturally, as a lot of cities have found out. So my colleagues have very much embraced the first one of those, and and kind of don't understand really the second one of those. So, for example, when we have, um, if you want to develop in Chicago, you probably you have to make like 20% of the units affordable, and what that means, they have to be um, rented to people that make less than 60% of the area median income, usually, as that is. So the problem is a lot of developers see that and then they choose not to build at all, which has caused some problems.
Mhm. Okay. Um, so let me sort of go back to your background and sort of
Yeah.
what do you remember about your MBA? And then we'll come back to the city. What do you remember about your MBA, and how has that sort of been helping you
So
in your
I
current?
had a wonderful experience at Booth. I was, prosecuting financial crimes, public corruption cases by day, and then I'd go to Gleacher in the evening. Sometimes I would instead go over and take the class at Harper instead, because I was at 26 in California, so I could get right over there. So I really had a wonderful experience. And when I look back on some of the specific experiences. Uh, I had both Professor Kaplan and Professor Meadow. I know they both have disciples. I loved them both, and that taught me a lot about financial rigor that I use in all areas of my life. In fact, like I said, I teach finance at DePaul now. I kind of adopt Meadows' persona when I do it. Like, I've done this in the real world. These crazy academics. They kind of uh, I've adopted that. I remember when I took uh, Nick Epley's class, and about how people's environment can affect their behavior, and I think about that from time to time. I remember taking a sales class where they
Mhm.
always said, when you start making sales calls, like, write a script down. And unfortunately, in my job, I have to call people and ask them for money, like, on occasion, if not often. And so having, like, in a weird way, that was sort of taught to me at Booth. Um, I had to look at a lot of real estate stuff. I took Professor Pagliari twice, and I learned a
Mhm.
lot in that class that I have to use often now in the zoning side of things that I remember. And then I took Professor Shiva Kumar
Yep.
for microeconomics and competitive strategy as well. And I remember he said to me at the end, after I'd had him twice, and I said, "Oh, what else do you teach? I feel like I really understand." And he said, "If you take my class again, I will think that you did not understand my lecture on diminishing marginal returns," which I found funny. So I had really a wonderful experience at Booth, and I key into that education despite, being 12 years out of there. I key into that education a lot. And not to mention, I still have a lot of friends uh, that I met through my booth experience. Now, I will say this: it took me 4 years to graduate at night. I was prosecuting by day at a lot of quarters where I just took one, and it worked for me. But I know you're supposed to be a tight 2.5 years, and I took my time, and I think I'm happy that I did.
So let me ask you this. Would you recommend to our current students, we have a lot on today, that they
Yeah.
think about a career in public service?
I would. I would say that. I find it very rewarding, but I will also say this. If you and I really more specifically if you try to run for something,
Hmm.
if you're going to run for public office, have something that you want to do in that role. So I had in 2020, I ran for Cook County State's Attorney unsuccessfully, but I'd worked in that office for 7 years. Thought I was on the wrong track. Thought I knew how to fix it. Um, didn't work out, but nonetheless, that was why I did it.
Hmm.
And I never thought I was going to run for anything again. But I came home from military deployments in like early 2022, and a sort of this uh, encampment had sprung up kind of right near me, and it very much over time became not a safe place for the people living there, for the residents, or for commuters, etc. You had three people got shot out there, one of them fatally. You had four armed robberies. It was just kind of this wild thing, and
Hmm.
this is kind of right by the Green Line L stop at Lake, kind of
Hmm.
not too far from like Gibson's Italia. You have a lot of people living around there.
Hmm.
And I remember I heard there was a new ward that had been created where I live. And I remember thinking, gee, as I was walking through there with my 3-year-old daughter at the time, and saw somebody sort of using a needle like 5 feet from me. And I remember thinking, gee, somebody ought to do something about this. And then that was the germ that made me think, maybe I ought to run for alderman, even though I haven't really had any time in city government. And that was like the reason I ran. And then once I got in, first of all, that, by the way, we ended up after 7 months of hard work, that issue is gone. But um, once I got in here, I saw our fiscal problems, how public safety was going the wrong way. We weren't doing a lot of economic growth, and I was like, okay, I have bigger things we need to work on now.
Hmm. You talked about the faculty, and it's amazing that you remember many of them. And
I do. I probably could even ripped off a few more. So if you had me as a student and I didn't mention names, not because I don't remember you, I just I wanted to keep specific things. Beyond that, when I think of a few others, when I was deployed to Qatar, or Qatar, I guess as we call it in the Navy, or the military, I was at Air Force Central Command, and the 3-star general who was head of Air Force Central Command was a guy named Jeffrey Harigian. And General Harigian, I traveled 5,000 miles to work for a guy who was from the West Burbs and went to Lyons Township, by the way. And he took a liking to me despite being my relatively low rank, because I had like a super strong Chicago accent. I think he missed that. But he would occasionally like go on flights with like people in the squadron. So he was both able to lead people, but also like be in the trenches with people. And I feel like sometimes you see leaders that do one or the other. And I took a lot from his ability to literally be in charge of, a third of our air fleet in a way, because it's the whole Middle East, but also be able to maintain kind of the common touch of being a member of the military. So those are a couple folks I'd mention.
Mhm. And you've still kept your connection to the military. Maybe you could talk about what do you do still?
Yeah, so I am still in. I'm the first actively drilling reservist in the history of Chicago City Council. This was told to me um, in the middle of a council meeting on Veterans Day, and I popped up and I would have said, "Geez, who would have thought a white Irish guy could still be the first anything in Chicago City Council?" There were 300 people in this room, and it was like silent. I was like, "Wow, tough room here," but it's something I take a lot of pride in. I still do drill 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year. with the Navy. When I was deployed to Qatar, I got this really odd job there of tracking how the Taliban gets its money. And I was coming right out of the JP Morgan and the prosecutor's office where I did the same thing. So it was kind of a real continuation of what I did. So I was properly used by the military. It's funny, in my reserve unit, Pete Buttigieg was in my military unit.
Oh,
He was
wow.
literally sent to Afghanistan to carry a rifle and like guard a one-star general. And like he could have been the best public affairs officer in the history of the military. and that is what the Navy decided to have him do. So however, I was more properly assigned based on my skill set. And then during COVID, I was reactivated, sent to Germany to European Command Headquarters, and my job there was essentially watching the entire European Command, which came down to watching the Russians and watching people that were shooting stuff into Israel. And the most jarring, perhaps, moment I had during that was I was on duty the night of January 6th.
Mhm.
And, which was at the night of January 6th, of course, was the day here in the States. And, and the way the room looks where I worked, is the main watch floor. Picture like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. You got a big screen that kind of has where every piece of military aircraft and ship is, in the European theater. And then you got smaller screens that have on front of you that have that information as well. And I remember, and you have like little TVs as well. And I remember seeing like all the, people breaking windows at the Capitol and, really feeling like disconnected from my country at that point in time. I hadn't stepped foot in the U.S. in months and months at that point. And then also I had a two-star general behind me being like, is that plane out of place? How about that plane? Is that plane out of place? I'd be like, sir, no. And he goes, all right, well, you see anything out of place, run to my office and we're calling the Secretary of Defense like immediately. So I'm sitting there for the next 13 hours, just like drinking Monster Energy one after the other, watching like every Russian asset to make sure that they didn't try and take advantage of things
Mm.
that were chaotic in our government.
Mm. It's an amazing story. Um, we have a question. I don't know. It's kind of a tricky one. What do you know now that you wish you knew while you were at Booth? And sort of that sort of advice you would give to somebody who's at Booth and thinking about going into public service, maybe.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I met a lot of friends at Booth, but I sort of wish I had met more. The one thing I will say about the day program versus the evening program, in the day program, you're kind of in your cohort, you're going to become close with those people, and you got to and so it's the relationships more easily make themselves. Like I said, I was in the evening program. I took 4 years, made a lot of friends, but Booth gives you so many opportunities to meet your classmates. And I hate the word network, but I'll say network and make friends. And I wish I had taken more advantage of that
Mm.
during my time as a student there because it's tough. You work all day, you go to class at night, you try and participate in some of the stuff, but it's tough. But looking back, I wish I had taken more advantage of that.
Okay, another piece of advice. What do you have advice do you have for an entrepreneur trying to raise money or anybody trying to raise money? Like,
Whew. Yeah, so I did do a stint at in between JP Morgan and the military. Did a short stint at Hyde Park Venture Partners, which is a small venture firm, but it actually kind of sprouted out of Hyde Park Angels,
Mhm.
which was initially really attached to University of Chicago. In fact, we'd have the Hyde Park Angels meetings would be at Gleacher then. They still may be. I don't think so, but they used to be at Gleacher all the time. And I would say having understanding your compelling story and what problem you're going to solve is like what every investor is looking to find, and really make it kind of like a tight story. Even since you know leaving that, when people have come to me and said, oh, you should help me with this venture, this business I'm trying to do, they'll tell you like 5 different things they're trying to do.
Mm.
And you're sort of like, look, you got to at least make this like a staircase of I'm going to do
Mhm.
this to this. And by the way, no one's going to believe these financial projections where you say you're growing like 10x every time, and your working capital needs have not like
Mhm.
increased at all. So, that's very high level advice I would give for folks that for ventures that I've seen work out and ventures that I've seen haven't.
Mhm.
So,
So I'm going to ask some maybe current affairs type questions and see what the audience comes up with as well. One, which is related to the question that came in, is sort of about Doge, sort of broadly,
mhm.
and has that? What do you think of it broadly, and how is that affecting Chicago? The cuts that are coming.
Yeah, it is. I think a lot of people are finding the government cutting fraud, waste, and abuse is a good thing. But then you have some areas where like the cuts don't seem to be making a lot of sense at the federal level. I mean, you talk about the FAA firing a lot of people, then all of a sudden it seems you got a lot of plane crashes. You have the VA, which isn't functioning particularly well. You have veterans who wait months for care, and the VA announced they're going to fire 83,000 people, which doesn't seem the right thing to do. So it seems like the Doge at the federal level has become a little bit uh, misguided in a way, and not just simply trying to cut fraud, waste, and abuse. How that could affect the city of Chicago is not yet known. I will say that of our $18 billion budget, we get about, I think the number's about 3.5 billion from the feds. And by the way, at any given time, we have spent, or I shouldn't say at any given time, but at this moment in time, we have spent about $500 million and expect to get that back from the federal government. Now, a lot of this stuff has been like baked already, so it can't, the current president can't take that all away, or can't easily take that away. Um, but I mean, think of a specific department. The Chicago Department of Public Health gets over 80% of its funding from the federal government.
Mhm.
So when you're thinking about that, are we going to be we if that all got cut, we'd have to decide, all right, are we going to do polio vaccines, or are we going to do AIDS testing? Like we'd have
Mhm.
to make some seriously tough and terrible decisions.
Mhm. Um, Question, this is just my curiosity. If you would comment on what's happening with the Chicago Bears and where they may or may not end up.
Yeah, real tough to say on that. It is right now we're getting to a little bit of like the 11th hour on that things. And you always hear, nobody really does anything until the 11th hour when it comes to that. It is, up to this point it has been, well, the Bears have asked for everything and we've counter offered with nothing. That's where all this started. So the question I often get, it's kind of uh it always delivered in sort of a tough way from the media, is like, are you in favor of taxpayer dollars for to be given to a sports team? It's always kind of asked like that. And you're like, well, I'm not in favor of that, but let's say you said, well, it's going to be a portion of or it's going to be the revenue that the stadium brings in. Can they borrow against that stream? Then you're like, well, that kind of makes some sense.
Mhm.
Well, how about infrastructure to around the stadium? What will are you willing to think about that? Well, I mean, we do infrastructure stuff all the time, so that seems to make some sense. Well, you could look beyond that in terms of hotel revenue that comes in and things, and what should we do on that? The story on this seems to be changing every day, in the
Mhm.
sense that one minute they're looking at the lakefront again. Then all of a sudden the Michael Reese site, they're looking at. Now they've pivoted back to Arlington Heights. So it's what, 5:49 now. By the time 6 o'clock comes, the story will be different. So um, I know that's very little insight, other than the only insight I can give you is that it's a very fluid situation.
Um, we have a question that came in earlier, which is, what do you have as an advice for somebody who wants to contribute to local politics, other than sort of, we could give money, but what are other ways people should be involved, should contribute, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, number one way I'd say is make sure you vote, but I kind of gonna put that. That's probably the obvious one. But I'd also say, organize around things that you care about. If you really care about your local school, you should join your local school council. If you really care about the park, you could organize around making sure the park looks good, or join. I think all the parks have a park advisory council, that really helps organize people into making sure that these things are well preserved and well funded, etc. So there's a lot of ways to get involved with community and local government, and I highly recommend them as rewarding. Even though we have like 1 million public offices here, you don't have to run for one of them to do public service in Chicago.
Well, so you let me do a segue then. What are you going to run for after this?
So at that, it is. I will say this, getting back to the other things that I talked about earlier. Uh, I will not run for something unless there is a clear, like, this is what I want to do in that position. So, I'm unlikely to ever run for like comptroller of something or clerk of something unless I really think like I have something I could deal with this. With regard to the city, I mean, I mentioned our budget for next year, so I'm really squarely focused on trying to see how can we make our situation better in 25 before we start thinking about what should we do in 2027 when all of city government is due to turn over.
Mhm. We have a great question. As an Irish Chicagoan, what is your perspective on the new Pope coming from Chicago?
Oh wow, I think it's kind of one of these unexpected treats. I talked about all the great things Chicago is going for it. Now we have the Pope as well. It's worth noting my dad's Irish, but my mom's parents are actually Greek and Swedish immigrants. So I have a good mix going. Um, but I think it's just fantastic that we have the Pope from here. I know that we have invited him to Chicago, and I hope he takes us up on the invitation here, because it's a great thing for the city of Chicago to have the Pope having come
And
through.
along that, like, what do you see as the benefits from the Obama Library coming up, which is, like a couple blocks from where I am today at the Harper Center?
Yeah, I mean there are very rosy projections as far as the amount of visitors that the Obama Library will get. I know it is behind schedule, but hopefully that will uh, get done soon, and then I mean, we're likely to get more than 500,000 visitors a year to the Obama Library, and that, of course, would be great for our hospitality businesses, our hotels, um, and other attractions as well.
Okay. So let me ask you just how do you spend your time? Like, how do you get work-life balance? How do you try to manage all the different things that you need to do?
Yeah, I guess I'm fortunate in that, I essentially have three jobs that pay me. I have still, obviously in city council, but I teach finance at DePaul. I am still in the Navy, and I really enjoy those things, which makes, if you enjoy your work-life balance becomes a lot easier. Beyond that, I do have three very small children. I have three girls. I have a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, and 2-year-old, which keeps me busy as a father. Fortunately, these kids love to go to parades because I make them do that often. But that I try and get the occasional golf round in as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
So that's how I keep myself busy.
Um, we have a question about aldermanic privileges. I don't know
Yeah.
what they are. Maybe you want to say something about them.
So I think what the person's asking about is aldermanic prerogative. And what that essentially means is it's a very controversial thing that if the alderman doesn't want that, whatever it is, in his or her ward, the alderman can pretty much shut that thing down.
Hmm.
And that has um, had a that has put a lot of damper on developments, I will say. And the reason for that is because what I've discovered is the people that already live there, they kind of don't want anything else there. In fact, in the West Loop, what I see, if I'm looking at development, let's say, between Halsted and Racine and Washington Street to the north, and let's say Van Buren to the south, in that area, what the developers will say to me is, Bill, I'm building a 600-foot tower over on Fulton Street, and that's already been approved. And you're kind of jamming me up at 300 feet here. Like, what's the deal? On one hand. On the other hand, what my residents say is they're building 600-foot towers on Fulton Street. There's no infrastructure to do that, so you can't build anything here. And then I'm forced to sort of split the baby in a way that makes everybody kind of mildly irritated, in terms of that. But you have a lot of alders that just don't approve a whole lot of things, and that is part of the reason we have a significant housing shortage in the city. But one of the things that makes this difficult to sort of solve is aldermanic prerogative is not something that's like in an ordinance or in a law, but it's sort of that we will, defer to each other on things. As much as we tend to argue on some of the big things, I have to take, a loading zone or a new sign permit. If you have a non-conforming sign, these things have to go to like licensing committee and zoning committee. And if all my colleagues like universally hate me, I can't get anything done in my ward. So it forces us to work together, but also, who am I to say that a loading zone shouldn't be in the 40th ward? Like the alderman there is far better versed to make that decision. So it's tough to, tough to sort of get rid of aldermanic prerogative. But I do think there's a lot of these other non-elected blue ribbon committees that always seem to have to want to get, the zoning board of appeals or planning commission or Department of Buildings or Department of Housing or the Department of Planning and Development or the Landmarks Commission. There's a lot of extra stuff that goes through there that just doesn't have to. So I feel like if we could start cutting things, I don't think we have to start at aldermanic prerogative, because it's kind of difficult to get at.
What one word describes how you feel as a Booth alum?
Proud. I mean, having the Booth name, people assume that correctly, usually, that you have a certain amount of intelligence and can deal with business and financial rigor, and that the Booth name carries that. And I'll go ahead, and even though it's a recorded session, I'll contrast it with Wharton. I had a wonderful time at Wharton as well, but when I was at Wharton, they always said, oh, from Penn here, every Ivy League school wants to have a president that graduated from there, and now Penn Wharton has one, and they don't have to spend a lot of time talking about it. When you bring up Wharton, people immediately start talking about the president. But so if I lean into Booth is still maintains just a fantastic reputation throughout the world.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Probably got myself in trouble here with my Wharton folks, but it's truth. Yeah.
So let me ask you one last question, just about are there things that you're reading that you would recommend to the audience, things that you're listening to that you feel are interesting that they should look into?
Yeah. So I often, there's a lot of, with Senator Durbin stepping down from his Senate seat, and then you have a bunch of people kind of trying to run for that Senate seat, and that's kind of opened other offices and things. So, and then of course, so you have a lot of campaigns going on right now, and then additionally, you have the fact that the Democratic Party lost. In the last election, we lost the presidency and both houses of Congress. So between all the campaigns I've seen, with very rare exception, are kind of like, this is my personal story, and this is why Donald Trump is bad. And that's kind of the end of the story. And you're thinking, well, but wait a minute. We, as the Democratic Party, need to be putting forth a message and a plan. Like, when we get back in power, this is what our vision is for the country, or you could say the city, the county, whatever the heck it is. But what is our vision going forward and our values in this country? So I have spent a lot of time on Ezra Klein's book Abundance, and how maybe we should be looking at how government can help the economy flourish. In some ways, fostering industries, and sometimes getting out of the way. But so I read Abundance, and now I've been kind of going back to it. I don't agree with all of it, but I agree with with a lot of it and how we Democrats can talk about our contrasting vision for this country.
That's great. And Bill, I just want to say thank you for coming onto the Distinguished Speaker Series event. Thank you for being so direct, open, transparent, and also being inspiring to the audience. I really
Well,
appreciate you taking the
Well,
time.
I was honored as when you sent me the email and said, "Would you like to do this?" I was like, "I think you met my dad here." I don't, So I was very honored to be noting the august folks that have been in this series. I'm honored to be asked and included, and always there to do anything I can to help an institution that gave a lot to me. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks everyone for signing in today.